Next from Chicago, at an event hosted by the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, Tracy Siska, the executive director of the Chicago Justice Project, and Kim Foxx, a candidate for Cook County State's Attorney, discussed the city's effort toward criminal justice reform. This runs about 50 minutes.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking everyone at the campaign for providing me the opportunity and the platform. So I'm the founder and executive director of the Chicago Justice Project. It was started 10 years ago to push a new way of looking at transparency. So traditionally, when people deal with transparency, especially in the criminal justice system, but everywhere, it is a community organization or a researcher fighting for one small data set from one single institution. And I view that, especially coming from an academic perspective, as very limiting, because to really understand what the Chicago police are doing, you have to understand what I call as the inputs and the outputs. Who's calling 911? What are they calling for? How is it responded to? And then how does it come out of the police department? Meaning, how does it or does it not proceed to the prosecutors or the courts? So I call that, and we call that a systemic view. So we don't fight for single data sets from agencies. We are fighting for all of their data from all of the agencies all at the same time, right? Because we want to be able to provide this holistic view. We do a lot of fighting and a lot of advocacy work trying to get the press away from covering single, what would be called heater cases, and focus on the trends. Because when you focus on heater cases, traditionally you scare people more than you have to, or you misrepresent what's going on over the overall of the response to anything. It could be sexual assault, gun violence, you name the topic. We need a systemic view. So that's basically what CJP is pushing. Obviously, over the last 9 months to a year now, the city, the county's justice system hasn't recovered. It's still reeling from the Laquan McDonald videotape release. And to one extent or another, unfortunately, maybe 100 years of similar type incidents. Not as brutal, but every 5 or 10 years you can come up, if you work on advocacy, reform of policing especially, you can come up with these. Every 5 or 10 years there's a scandal. Every 5 or 10 years the recipients of that scandal who come out the worst are people of color. This is a Chicago tradition. And we have had just as equally amount of time, 100 years of promises of those, how they're going to reform the system. In 1960, the thought was we finally have the guy that's going to change policing. O.W. Wilson came in. And he created the police board. Actually, it was created so he could run the police department. But over the next 14 years, the agency that would become the Office of Professional Standards, which investigates police accountability, was renamed 4 times and reorganized 4 times because they kept having scandals they couldn't control. So what's going on now is not an aberration. It's a pattern of 100 years of failed, bad policing, bad justice system activities, and then a widespread systemic failure for 100 years of being able to get reforms that work. So when I was approached for this, it was, they talk about my vision. And usually, since I work in it every day, my vision is usually pretty pessimistic, right? But I thought of 4 major points I think that need to be worked on. The first one is we have a desperate need in Chicago for leaders that embrace and will take the political heat that comes with bringing in evidence-based decision-making and best practices. As a professor and an academic researcher, we don't have all the answers, but there are certain things we know because we have done 50 studies or 100 studies from various political perspectives all over the country. And even getting those things into any criminal justice system, let alone Chicago and Cook County, is really, really hard. It's almost impossible with the atmosphere in here to have one of the executives in these systems, whether it's the police, the prosecutors, the 911 center, the courts, to actually bring in best practices because there's so much of a negative media coverage and negative political consequences if they don't work. This is throughout, and when I'm talking about throughout the entire system. So here's something that many people haven't paid attention to, but the probation was taken over, right? In the midst of this Laquan and everything else, we had an incredible failure because of patronage and lack of concern about probation that even after multiple warnings, the Supreme Court had to come in and take over probation. I mean, that is, if people had the idea, the big holistic picture of the system, we have multiple failures going on at the same time through multiple agencies. It doesn't mean there aren't really hardworking people in there. There are. Are they trying to do their best? There are. But we also have to understand we need leaders that are going to empower, that are going to bring best practices in, and are going to be able to withstand the heat, knowing that what they're doing is best for communities and best for their agencies and the administration of justice. We haven't had that. You can see from the Laquan tape and the fact that there was a massive cover-up after it, we haven't had it. The fact that we didn't get a prosecution of Van Dyke announced or put in the process till after the tape came out, that even in 2010, 12, 15, very little has changed, unfortunately. Here's my second point. We need, on top of being best practices, we need independence. We also need not only independent, but they have to have the knowledge and to be able to either talk to experts or have to interact with experts or to know what best practices are around the country. If you look at the fallout from the Laquan McDonald, it seemed like Chicago had this opportunity after the termination or resignation of Superintendent McCarthy. We had the opportunity to bring in a real best practices focused superintendent. Race politics took over. We ended up with a guy who's very nice. He's been in the force for 30 years, and somehow those 30 years, right, he's part of the 100 years I was just talking about, he hadn't seen a single case of police misconduct over those 100 years. And he was so, even after everything that happened with Laquan, he was so confident of that, he told the press that, right? That's not someone who's going to bring in massive innovation, massive best practices, and going to break the culture, which I'll get to in a second. Oh, I'm going to get to it right now. The third point is we need to find a way, and I don't have the prescription ready, but we have to break the culture. When you do misconduct, when you talk about police misconduct or any misconduct through any organization, people say, oh, you know, the mayor's talking, he gave $3 million to the Chicago Crime Lab at the University of Chicago to create a early warning system, this very sophisticated technology to look at all the data and find out who are bad cops. Listen, the commanders know who the bad cops are. The officers know who they are. They don't want to partner with them. Everyone knows. The problem isn't finding the bad cops. The problem is getting the good cops to tell on the bad cops. And we see a perfect example is Baltimore. Freddie Gray, if I'm getting his name right, I apologize if I'm not. There's so many, it's hard to keep track of all their names. Somehow his back was broken. Somehow he dies. There was a group of cops. One of them knows. No one talked. That's what basically killed that prosecution. Holding someone accountable is none of the cops would talk. You can't have that and think that you're going to get the respect of the community. You're asking community members to go out of their way and risk their lives, especially in violence cases when they've witnessed it, because they have to go back to that community where that gang member is, or the violence perpetrator is, or the friends of that violence perpetrator are. You want the citizens to take greater risks than the police officers themselves are willing to do. And even for good officers, I shouldn't say most, but you will talk to many of them, and I have over the decade I've been doing this, in 20 years I've been researching it, and many of them try to keep their head down. They want assignments that doesn't put them in contact with those kinds of officers. And they know, or they think, there is no support above them and within the department among their colleagues to talk. So no one does. Those 10 officers or 9 officers that covered up in the Van Dyke thing, they didn't get together and have a hush-hush conversation where they were all talking to work it out. They just knew that's what you do. You know, so there's not a massive conspiracy where they all get together in a secret room and, you know, concoct the story. They know what the story is. They've worked long enough that they know exactly how this goes. And until that breaks, we are not going to get the cooperation from the communities that we need to make the communities safer. That's just a fact. If there's a step's got to be taken, if the courage has got to be taken, it's got to be taken within the department. That's a reality. And the fourth thing is we got to break the political control. For better or worse, officers, good officers within the department, there are many of them in Chicago, they feel as if the accountability system is completely rigged. If you have juice, if you have clout, you have nothing to worry about. If you don't, you're a minute away from being fired. Their level of fear of the accountability system was much greater than the likelihood of ever being fired. I mean, almost no one since the police board's basically been around outside of the last 12 months with Lori Lightfoot running it, 30% of the officers were ever fired. And that was only 1 or 2%. That's 30% of 1 or 2% that actually got sustained. I mean, it's minuscule who was fired. But they are scared, the good cops are scared to death of the political control over the police department and over the accountability system. Whether it was Rahm or Daley, whether it's aldermen, I'm not sure if this practice still goes, but I think they have a word in approving who their district commander is. That's a no-no. That terrifies cops, especially if the district commander is not the best guy, or you're on the outs of him because you don't get personally along with him. Then you're on the outs and you have to look for a transfer. That's got to go. That prohibits good cops. That's one of the things that prohibits good cops from coming forward and talking about what bad cops. And we need to completely reverse that so that we can foster and incentivize good officers to do their job, do it well, do it based on best practices, and free of what they think to be completely arbitrary discipline, right? And I just a quick story to show you how bad it is. When Bill Cozy was arrested for beating a black man he had cuffed to a wheelchair 10 times in the head and videotape in front of doctors and nurses in an emergency room, they eventually filed police board charges to fire him. And when he went around and told everyone, this is about 8 or 9 years ago, don't worry, I've got an alderman, they'll get to the police board. I'm not going to get fired. It's all taken care of. Bill Cozy eventually got suspended for five years. They didn't fire him. Now, the prosecutors could have got him for aggravated battery or felony. They got him a plea bargain of simple battery, which means he got to keep his job. A couple years later, my organization does a study showing the police board's not very good at firing officers, and I went to talk to their old executive director, and I said, you know, I told them the story about Cozy, and I said, could board members be gotten to, right? It's Chicago, everyone has the conspiracies of it. And he said, absolutely, right? Because he's no longer the executive director. He's absolutely, they could have. He goes, some came in and they knew everything that happened in the case responsibly. Some came in and I had no idea why they were voting whatsoever, right? So even he knew there was political influence over the police board decisions. That kind of stuff terrifies good, hardworking agents in the system when they have to worry about politics, not their performance, dictating whether they get let go. So, solutions. I run a transparency project, so I'm not sure you're not going to be surprised at this. I think we have to basically invoke almost absolute transparency. I am all for hiding, things that have to be necessarily done. The Freedom of Information Act is not the solution. It's way too broad and way too overused, and the courts, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, are way too slow. I'm in a lawsuit now. It's 10 months into it. That's too slow. The information has to be readily online so people can look at it anytime they want. Part of the fail of the accountability system when they reformed it from the Office of Professional Standards and they created a standalone for the Independent Police Review Authority is the Independent Police Review Authority would only put online the summaries of cases where they sustained misconduct against an officer. That was 1 or 2% of the cases. So in the other 98, 99%, citizens had to guess and trust them that they had done their investigation. It's a totally wrong way to do it. If you're doing your investigations or doing one right, everything needs to go online. Very few people will look, but just the act that they're putting that stuff online builds community trust. Everything in Chicago, if you have to FOIA something, you have to wait 5 years. Or in my case, sue, right? And I'm very lucky. You're looking at all of the Chicago Justice Project up here, right? Besides my great board, which David Melton's a member of. I got lucky enough to get pro bono services from DLA, so we can now litigate this. But prior to that, we would just get a denial on every FOIA we filed, every one, because they knew we didn't have the resources to fight. So yes, it's great in the FOIA that we can sue, but if you don't have the resources or capacity, it's completely meaningless as a solution. So what we need from our criminal justice system to start to build that trust, we got to find a way to break the politics, and we got to make everything as transparent as possible. The more transparent the accountability system is, the more good officers will be able to see why bad officers got fired. And they will see it's not arbitrary. They will see that the members are taking, that the board members are taking their time and being considerate. They will see that the investigation by whatever replaces Independent Police Review Authority, we're going to find out tomorrow when the legislation gets introduced, is doing their job because the entire bulk of that investigation is online for people to read. Short of that rebuilding trust, I'm at a loss for how that's going to happen. Short of that, I don't think people understand what these communities have gone through, and they suffer from both things, which the media doesn't cover. When they cover underserved communities and their relationships with the police, they really think it's all about abuse, and that's half. The other bad is bad policing. They're not keeping the community safe. They're not responding the way they could. And just real quickly, because there's a couple members that are here on this, we tried to have a sexual assault task force where we studied from call for service to adjudication, 5 years of sexual assault cases. And I thought my organization would run it. We're outsiders from our part of the sexual assault or domestic violence community, and there's a lot of animosity at times between the justice system and that community. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that the justice system is not serving people. Justice system wanted no part of that task force. Right? They didn't care about all the innuendo. And basically all it did was strike fear. All it does is feed the fear that they're not doing their jobs. But it was even that we would give them the analysis, all the data analysis of all their data they'd have in 6 months. We'd release it in 2 years, and we'd let them plenty of time to do reforms. Not even that could get approval in this justice system we have here, and that's incredibly scary. Because that just leaves everyone, what you're left with is anecdotal information that thus becomes fact because some reporter has picked it up. And we'll get to, the media is a whole nother talk. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time, and I'm open to any questions you have.
I am thrilled to be here, and I'm actually very grateful to have to follow Tracy's presentation because I think it sets the proper tone for where I should begin when we talk about criminal justice reform, particularly here in Chicago. And the historical perspective that Tracy gave, we often neglect. We are in the moment. I started running for this office, it's been a year. In August, in end of August of 2015, before what was happening that we've seen in the wake of the Laquan McDonald scandal. At the time that I had decided to put my hat into the ring and talk about the issues with our criminal justice system and some of the failings that we had, it was around issues of who are in our jails and why are they there and what's happening as a result to the communities that are impacted by our criminal justice system. And in the beginning, going around and talking about our criminal justice system, I was using examples around police accountability in the wake of Freddie Gray in Baltimore about Chicago, and reminding people, because I grew up here and I go just about everywhere talking about my experiences growing up in the city and growing up in the projects and being poor, largely because it sets the stage for me of how I want communities to be and feel. When you grow up in a poor in a violent neighborhood, when you personally experience violence, when you are the victim of crime, it shapes that trauma, shapes your worldview for the rest of your life. And there's data to support, evidence to support what trauma does to the brain of young people. And my brain has been affected by the trauma that I lived every single day. And a career in public service for me, particularly as a prosecutor, was to make sure that every child in every neighborhood could be free of that type of trauma, and that our systems that were designed to protect were not inflicting, and that we could do both, protect without doing harm. And when I started running for this office back then, we were talking about Freddie Gray and not Laquan McDonald. I would talk about what happened and the fact that we as a nation have this police torture reparations fund. And people would get uncomfortable. And talking about what happened that we got to a point where we were paying money to people, reparations, who were victims of torture. And how do you get to the point in the system that it comes down to that? And not only were we paying money, but we were also required as part of the agreement and the settlement in the city to teach what happened here. That this was, in fact, a teachable moment for us. And then talking about the criminal justice system from there, like who were the victims there? Who was held accountable there? Talking about police accountability with this big, egregious history that we had. And what we knew was that largely these were men, mostly men of color on the South Side, mostly black men. And the distrust that comes as a result when we see the system failing in such an egregious way, whether it's people sitting on death row for crimes that they didn't commit, whether it's the public's trust in the system and the belief that people are safe and are being tried for crimes that they committed. And I can tell you that going into rooms and talking about that and talking about the disparities in our criminal justice system and the lack of data to substantiate that did not resonate very well in many spaces. There were some spaces, Senator Harmon is here, out in Oak Park where I went out and spoke on these issues very early on, and people were saying, tell us, we want more. And then in the wake of Laquan McDonald in November, it was all we talked about. And so to Tracy's point, these flashpoint moments, these moments where we are engaged, and then the engagement subsides is what creates a stagnant and dysfunctional criminal justice system. It is. And I take the victory in March and what I would hope to be an eventual victory in November as not a flashpoint moment to tell you how I'm going to deal with just the next police accountability issue. Because that's what people want. Like, no, tell us how you'll do this different. No, our system needs to be reformed. And what is the role of the prosecutor to ensure that that reform or transformation takes place? So in the days since the election, I have taken very seriously of what does that look like. People ask you, it's like the go-to, what does my first 100 days look like? And I'm always struck by what magic can happen in the first 100 days on a system that needs reform for 100 years. So the goal is to just be there for 100 days and still be plugging away at it. But in the time since then, I have gone out, and to the point that Tracy made about best practices. When we talk about violence here in Cook County and Chicago, if you go anywhere in the country, if you read national publications, we are at the heart of the conversation around violence. Everywhere I go, everyone I talk to, what's going on in Chicago? There are ugly truths about ourselves that are being exposed to the nation, and as I said during the beginnings of the campaign and continue to say, the eyes of the world are watching us. And here we are in the grips of the numbers that continue to soar every week. When we surpassed 500 last week, and the pit in our stomachs continue to grow, and the question of what do we do about this rising violence, what legislation can we pass that will just make us all feel better and not necessarily make us safer? The question is always that I have is, what does the data show? What are other areas doing? What are best practices? We used to stand in, I guess, in the bad kids corner with Los Angeles and New York in terms of crime. The Los Angeles was known for the Bloods and the Crips and the gang wars of the 80s and 90s. In New York, people will tell you, you could not hover around New York too late at night. And that here in Chicago, we have more homicides in New York than LA, or than in Chicago than New York and LA combined. That you'll hear Superintendent Johnson tell you that we take more guns off the street than twice as many as New York and LA combined. And so at some point, there has to be a recognition in our little brother, little sisterhood of we're not the top 2 cities anymore, that we're doing something wrong here. And part of the way that you know what you're doing wrong is to be able to see what it is that you're doing. That transparency is about fixing what's broken. You cannot fix what you cannot measure. And it is really one of the most unsexy things to talk about as a prosecutor is data. Because people want me to talk about blood and guts and horror, but It's there. We know it. We see it. The media has done a great job of amplifying what's happening in our streets. The question is, what are we doing about it? And how do we know that those fixes that we've put into place have worked or have failed? And so what I've done in the intervening months since then has gone out to New York and met with the prosecutor in Manhattan and met with the prosecutor in Brooklyn. And I've gone out to Los Angeles and met with the top prosecutor in Los Angeles and the top prosecutor in San Francisco. What are you all doing? What are your best practices? Because we hear bits and pieces that we want to hear to justify actions that we're taking, but just sit me down and show me what you're doing. And one of the number one things that they do is use data. You know I'm right. They have data. They have, and I can tell you, I was fascinated. They have R&D, research and development people on staff in the prosecutor's office. R&D people. They have data analysts working in their office. They have crime strategies unit. I'm going to use a phrase that we rarely hear in Cook County. A strategy. They have a strategy. A strategy. And I say that with some level of indignation, largely because we have become so accustomed to a reaction. We react to crime. We react to what comes to us. We wait knowing, what's going to happen. We brace ourselves. We brace ourselves for Labor Day weekend. We brace ourselves for Memorial Day. We brace ourselves for the heat, and then we respond. What other jurisdictions do in the wake of trying to deal with crime and violence is they strategize. And so they have, in these offices, a crime strategies unit. And the crime strategies unit takes data from the police department and other law enforcement agencies. And the state's attorneys and the district attorneys have that information. Because what we know is that for a lot of folks who come in and out of our criminal justice system, the repository for that information is the state's attorney's office. So whether we decide to file a case or not file a case, we have that data. If that case was, we know who these folks are. And so we can take that information and marry it with what we're finding out from our law enforcement partners. Another thing that they do is they meet and they share their data. The police department, if we have the strategic targets list, the state's attorney's office should know who's on that list. And then within the state's attorney's office, people who have those cases should gather together and say, what do you have, what do you have, what do you have? They do autopsies, if you will, of cases that come in and see, where did we miss? We've got this person who had been out on parole or what have you. They sit together with that data, mine it, and say, you had this person in juvenile. What happened? What was the sentence in juvenile? What happened on that second arrest? Did the police know that we had this information? I mean, it is a minefield of data. And then taking that data and marrying the data that you have with your partners in law enforcement and in the community. And then making the case to the community and to your legislatures about what makes sense. And I was inspired, if you can't tell. I want to dance because the history that we've had in Cook County has been say little, don't share. There are ugly truths that will be discovered by using data. And I have to say that the first thing that I have to do, if we are to reestablish that trust, is to start having difficult conversations with ugly truths and be unafraid to do it. We have an issue of race in this county. We have an issue of race in the city. We have communities that are largely affected by violence who do not have faith in the system. And these are largely communities of color. And what we know, as Tracy said, there's a lot of anecdote around what policing looks like or what it feels like. And I have a quick anecdote from my personal life, and I'll wrap this up soon. My grandmother used to hate to go to the doctor, And we'd be like, there's like blood coming out of your ear. It's probably time. And it would have to take something that dramatic. And I finally sat down with her one day and asked her, why is it so difficult for you to go to the doctor? My grandmother was raised in the South, and she was talking about the trials that were done in the South on African American men, where they were injecting them with syphilis, and they would come out and they didn't know that they were sick. And years later, it was unraveled, and we saw this big conspiracy of what was happening to African American men who were going to the doctor in the South. And this chilling effect that it had on my grandmother and her own health. Acting off of things that happened decades ago, not even to her, permeated her vision of how she would take care of herself. That's what's happening in our communities right now. These anecdotes about what's happening with policing have to be looked at. And the way that you do that is you acknowledge that we have to do it and open the data. The fear is that we will find out that there are a disproportionate number of arrests coming from certain communities. The fear is that what we will find out is that some of the things that make our stomachs hurt will be substantiated. And then we will have to do something about it. And so as I move forward post-November, should I still be running or still be here, starting off rebuilding trust of the community by having a frank conversation about the truths that we need to uncover and about being completely transparent in how we do it. I agree, transparency is key. It is absolutely key. I am committed to being transparent and doing it in a way that's responsible, Tracy, so don't try to just get me to open it up tomorrow, but a way that's responsible. I know him. To be responsible about it so that we can look at, the prosecutor's office is a great place to start. We are the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system. Police arrest, they come to us. And it is the most opaque of the stakeholders in the criminal justice system. We are the most opaque. We have a tremendous amount of power and the least amount of transparency. I want to start my conversation and my push to reestablish trust with the community by saying this is who we are, and then laying out the steps about this is what we have to do. That's how we'll get back to trust. How we'll deal with the violence is the exact same way. Using evidence-based strategies, proactive, using data, working in partnership with other law enforcement agencies and the community, who will continue to come back to us the more open and honest and transparent we are with how we do our work. And then dealing with the issues, whether it's the influx of illegal guns coming into our communities, because the fact of the matter is they're not making more guns just to send to Chicago. We have to ask really difficult questions of why is it that we have twice as many illegal guns here? Who's bringing them in and why are they allowed to fester? And what is our policy about who's bringing those guns in? Then we can also use the data to craft policy, long-lasting policy, around how we deal with sentencing and sentencing reform. I often caution people that in the midst of violence and fear, knee-jerk policy reactions are the order of the day. And then decades later, a generation later, we look back and we say, what did we do? And the data will show us what's happened in the last 30 years in neighborhoods in Austin, in Inglewood, in Roseland, where communities where we've had high concentrations of incarceration for nonviolent drug offenses have continued to erode, where people returning from the prison system back into neighborhoods where jobs and education and economic opportunity are not available, and then the expectation that those communities will then rise up out of that and be productive. We have to ask ourselves, what are we doing? And all of that comes by not being afraid to have difficult conversations, to hold on to simple truths, to be transparent, and to actively engage in that transparency, to work with partners, to put it on the table and work together on strategic thinking, proactive thinking, with at the very core making sure that every kid in every neighborhood has the quality of life that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm thinking if you could both come up. If you have question cards, if you want to hold them up, and Nicole will come get those from you. And I'm going to ask one first from our board member, David. All right. So how optimistic are you about current proposed reforms, and what do you think is the single most important thing to accomplish? Will the Department of Justice investigation help with the current climate?
I'm actually very optimistic. I think with the Department of Justice, even with our history that we've had, the fact now that the Department of Justice, given everything, is now here, gives us the opportunity to really engage in serious long-term strategy. There is a sense that there will be a consent decree that emerges from the Department of Justice's review. And I think that consent decree gives us the opportunity to be bold, to get needed resources to deal with some bold ideas, and to not take such short incremental steps to deal with reform. And so I don't know that there's one singular reform piece that I'm yet to say is fully baked. I think the work that they're doing around police accountability and the independent organization and the like needs to be fully fleshed out. The community engagement in that piece is really critical. But I think in all of the despair that has happened that would leave us to be pessimistic, I think it is a tremendous opportunity for us to do great things.
I'm somewhat optimistic, I guess I gotta say. Just real quickly, we're going to replace the Independent Police Review Authority. I think it needs to be done. Civilian review around the country, unfortunately, doesn't work. As much as we all want it to, and we want to think it, there's no academic research that shows that it really works. The creation of an Inspector General for the Police Department, I think, is the most important, and I think that has a fair to decent chance of actually creating some really good change long term.
Thank you. Is this working? No? All right. So this is for both of you as well. What communities, could be cities, counties, or states, are practicing the kind of transparency that is needed in the justice system, if you have any good examples?
So I think from the prosecutor standpoint, it's an emerging practice. So the Vera Institute out of New York has been working with jurisdictions. So State's Attorney John Chisholm out of Milwaukee County in Milwaukee is cited as a good example. Part of the struggle that John Chisholm's jurisdiction had was when you collect data, there should be a mechanism by way to do it, and the technology in Milwaukee was just wretched. And so they worked with the Vera Institute to build out technology systems, which is great, a case management system that works. And what they did was they evaluated just what I'm talking about. You know, as Tracy talked about sex assault cases, they looked at, you know, the race of sexual assault victims, the race of sexual assault defendants, what happened with those cases based on whether it was, you know, a white defendant versus a black victim and the like, and really had like real robust data to sit and look at trends and then take those trends and make that into policy changes within the office based on every decision point that they were making. So I think John Chisholm's work out of New York has been cited. The Vera Institute did a similar work in New York and Manhattan, to some degree in Brooklyn, also in San Francisco.
So from my perspective, New York, because I'm about data and an Inspector General, which is about big data analysis. New York, LA, Seattle have all turned to those, but they've all unfortunately come out of bad experiences. New York stop and frisk. LA had a horrible violence problem, police officer involved shooting. Seattle's now either under consent decree or under investigation. So they all come out of that, but those are the three places I would say.
Great, thank you. These are great questions, you guys. I'm impressed. This is from Paul King from the Business Leadership Council. And this is for either of you who would like to comment. Given the move to release many of the African American men who are currently incarcerated in the city, what steps do you recommend for re-entry in their communities?
Yeah, so I don't know that there's necessarily a big move. I mean, we're talking about reallocation. But the reality is that the overwhelming majority of people who go into our criminal justice system come out. They eventually come out, unless you are convicted of the most heinous of crimes, and are serving life without the possibility of parole. The overwhelming majority of people come out. And so the question becomes, what happens once they get out? There's now more conversation around reentry. Again, in looking at best practices across the country, the New York District Attorney's Office in Manhattan and Brooklyn have a reentry initiative within the prosecutor's office, as well as in San Francisco. So again, historically, prosecutors' offices have been seen as our job is to charge, get to sentencing, and then our hands are off. But once you deal with reentry, that is a form of crime prevention. What we know is that if we arm folks with the ability to work, to have education, to re-engage in community, they are less likely to recidivate. And that recidivism, comes at a cost, whether it comes at a cost to a victim or an eventual crime. So looking at re-entry and having the prosecutor engaged in that is a form of crime prevention. Our goal should be, from the very beginning, again, part of the strategy, how do we measure our success, is will crime rates go down? And we look at the way crime rates go down by looking at recidivism. Recidivism goes down because you need someone who has come out of the system to not go back in. So it's critically important, and I think having your prosecutor leader say that and engage in that work is critically important.
That was perfect.
Okay.
You didn't say it louder.
Oh, sorry. That was perfect.
It was perfect, he said, for the record.
My apologies.
So we have two more. This one's from Alan Lindrup. So you talked about some of the current reform measures that are on the table legislatively, but are there any legislative or policy change that could be accomplished in a 4 or 5 year span that you think could most reduce racial disparities in Illinois or Cook County's criminal justice system? That's a big one.
All right. Yes. Taking TIF money and get rid of TIFs and use that money to invest in these communities. There's your answer. It's about economic development. Period. There's very little we're going to do, I shouldn't say that. There's very little long-term we're going to do criminologically to really get at this violence. It's about economic development. It's about giving opportunity. It's about not closing 50 schools in these areas, but opening 50 new ones. That's what it's about. It's not about, I fear that we put too many burdens and resources into criminal justice agencies who aren't equipped to solve this problem. The State Attorney's Office doesn't build schools or create factories or create jobs. That's not in their bailiwick. And the same thing for the Chicago Police, but we keep pushing resources onto them, like the violence is up, so hire 1,000 more cops. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to invest $1 billion in policing. If they last only 20 years, that is a $1 billion investment in policing to hire those 1,000 cops. What would that $1 billion do on the south and west side of Chicago to stop violence? If you give people a job, violence is going to plummet. And that's what the real solution in New York. That's a lot of what New York has done, plus gentrification, but that's a lot of what has gone on around the country. It's about economic development and not, unfortunately, policing. My 2 cents anyways.
And I would agree. I don't know about the TIF part.
That's fine.
I live in the burbs. I mean, I agree with the notion that to believe that there is a singular legislative fix that will deal with crime must be dispelled. That is not what happened in New York. That is not what happened in Los Angeles. That is not what happened. What they did was they invested in prevention efforts as well. And it gets tricky because it's complicated in talking about criminal justice issues and criminologic factors about who comes into our criminal justice system, which is why data matters. What we know is that, you know, the earlier you intervene in a person who has factors to come into our criminal justice system, the less likely they are to get there. So some of this has been, let's invest our resources early. We know truancy, for example. Again, they looked at data in San Francisco and said, who are the kids who are not coming to school? We know there's a greater likelihood for a truant individual, a truant child to end up in our criminal justice system. So then taking that data and creating their own target list of truants, then went to say, what does the family need? Is this a kid who's not coming to school because they are caring for a younger sibling or an ailing parent, a drug addicted someone? And how do we get those services there, in addition to the economic issues? And so prevention is the key in a lot of this. There is not a singular legislative fix. Illinois has strong gun laws. That what we need to look at is the data of how those laws are being implemented and impacted, who's putting the sentences out. I know we hear a lot about this revolving door. Well, we should see what that revolving door looks like and what are the factors. That's why the openness of the data matters, because as we look for fixes, whether legislatively or broadly, we should be able to substantiate why we're doing what we're doing. And the absence of that information could say, you know, we can save a lot of time and headache if we put these fixes in place. I mean, one quick thing before we go, when I was a state's attorney, we used to have to keep information on how many cases were dismissed on any given month and the reason why. And what we found was, you know, we were dismissing a lot of cases because police officers weren't showing up. And then you have to dig deeper and find out that we were scheduling police days on days that officers were off. That's what the data can tell you. And so when you look at, wow, there's all of these dismissals, the question becomes, one, what is the impact on the dismissal on that defendant, on that victim, on the people who are like counting on the system to work? How do you get to that? How do you then remedy it? Then we started coding when police officers had their days off, and we coordinated around that. Simple fixes, which then lessened the number of cases that were dismissed for that cause. That's what we need to be doing. That's what existing systems, instead of trying to continue to build on, let's tweak what we already know we have in place.
Thank you. So we have one more, which I think is an interesting one. This one's from Ori Pennick. What role does the Fraternal Order of Police play in maintaining, and how do either of you, are you able to work with that organization?
They're a tremendous impediment. The contract-wise, there are so many provisions that protect officers, prevent pattern research, so pattern investigation. So you can't use, for instance, and you can use pattern work for determining the sentence, like the amount of discipline, but you can't use a pattern in the initial investigation. So the FOP is a tremendous thing. From talking to previous people who have been federal investigators that have come into cities, I hosted the head of the office that is investigating Chicago now, but he quit after, or left after Ferguson. It's really hard for them to even impact the contract. So they rarely do. So that is going to be left to the city council to impact the police contract. We were hoping the feds would come in their investigation and do it. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. So the massive changes that need to be done in the contract are left to the city council and the people of Chicago. But they're a huge, huge problem.
And what I'll say on that is that the hope is, again, with transparency. I think most taxpayers don't know what those contracts contain. And so some of the limitations that we have around accountability from the criminal justice standpoint and the impact that the contract and the way we do our investigations impact our ability to file charges if need be, or how we make those decisions, it's left largely on the prosecutors not doing their job. I think we have to act in the bounds of the law and the evidence that's presented to us. I'm hopeful that these conversations around accountability and moving forward would also bring to light what are we working with, and not necessarily in an adversarial tone. These were collectively bargained for. These were not, the FOP did not, snap their fingers and this was created. This was part of our government institutions collectively bargaining over these provisions for decades. And so the suggestion that all of a sudden it's going to change overnight, or that somehow we're vilifying one side or the other, that's not what we should be doing. What we should be doing is knowing what we're working with and seeing what we can have an impact on. Because as Tracy said, you know, good police officers want the rules to work. And to wholesale suggest that the union is standing in the way, I don't think is the answer. The way that we do that as taxpayers is to say, what are we dealing with? If we're paying all this money out for settlements and the like, how do we get to this point? Having critical, thoughtful conversations about how we got here to this point as we move forward to ask those critical questions at negotiation time in the future.
Let's have a round of applause for our speakers.